Feminism has invaded our schools, the marketplace, the church, and the minds of men and women, and we are suffering for it. We men, who were made to be strong and competent providers and leaders of women and children, are being told that we're stupid, we're toxic, and we're not needed. The modern family depiction of a man is a silly, stumbling idiot who wouldn't be able to walk straight without his smart, put-together wife. This is a distortion and has caused many men to doubt and question their role and purpose in this world. This conversation with Father James Searby will change that for you. Father Searby has a popular podcast called Holiness for the Working Day, which I have a link for down in the description. His most widely listened to content is how we find God in the darkness of our suffering, anxiety, and fear, and how we can and must face it to become who God made us to be in this world. We talk about how to find God through the doubt, anxiety, and suffering that we all experience. In fact, when you suffer with God, your purpose becomes clear and you gain a strength that you might think is impossible. You become a man capable of remaining steady in the storms, and you become attractive to women and a capable provider and leader. We need to talk about what strong Christian masculinity and leadership look like and teach it effectively to men. I hope that you enjoyed this episode with Father James Searby. Father James Searby, welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Father, you have a very popular podcast called Holiness for the Working Day. And you've said that in order for us to meet the Father, in order for us to meet God, we must face our deepest fears, and that we all must have our own Gethsemane moment. What do you mean by that?
Oh. You know, some years ago, or about 2 years ago now, I was in the Garden of Gethsemane in Israel, in Jerusalem. And it's interesting because I'd never been there before. And it was after I went through an immense amount of suffering with anxiety and things. And when you enter into Gethsemane, you can feel the weight. You can feel the weight of what Jesus went through. It's almost like it's an antenna to the suffering of the world. Mm. And you look across, you see the temple, and you see a place of immense, even today, suffering, difficulty, strife, and yet at the same time, God present in the middle of it. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of people are under the impression that they need to create a life that's suffering free, and then somehow they're going to enter into this kind of like nirvanic state or something like that. And that's not the Christian message, certainly, but it's not what leads us to happiness. Mm-hmm. I saw really a great little meme today, and it just said, what feels like the path to heaven is the path to hell, and what feels like the path to hell is the path to heaven. Mm. And that avoidance of suffering, whether it's our own or other people's, the avoidance of the darkness is Jesus went into the place of darkness. That's where he is. That's where he decided to go. And he said, I'm going to enter into your suffering. And that's where you're going to meet me. Mm-hmm. So if I'm avoiding suffering, or if I'm pretending it's not there, or more importantly, if I'm trying to go from consolation to consolation to consolation in life, what happens is that I'm going to miss him. Mm-hmm. So that place of darkness, that place of difficulty, when I say darkness, I don't mean the place of evil, but that place where we're afraid to go. There's a great moment in Dune in the book. I don't know if they have it in the new movies. I think they had it in the old movie, where Paul Atreides turns to the Bene Gesserit, the head of the Bene Gesserits, and he goes, go to that place, that dark place that you're afraid to go, and you'll find me there looking back at you. Mm-hmm. And he was doing it as a threat, but in effect, that's what Jesus says. Like, if you go to that place, you're going to meet me.
It's interesting. What's interesting about that is, in our Catholic tradition, we have the sorrowful mysteries of the Rosary and the agony in the garden, which is obviously in the Garden of Gethsemane. The fruit of the mystery is conformity to God's will. Mm-hmm.
It's a place of total surrender. And here's the thing. Surrender is a difficult concept for a lot of men. It's a lot of women too, but it's a difficult place for a lot of men, and I would say particularly American men. Mm. So I have to kind of put on this. I'm okay. I've got this. I can handle it. And to surrender, and we all know the experience of surrender. Like somebody who's in a marriage and really surrenders to their wife knows the profound place of love. If you have a deep friendship and all of a sudden you surrender something to them and your friend turns and goes, "You too?" That's a place of intimacy, right? Well, it's the same kind of thing. It's that fruit. The fruit is a surrender to God's will because, Jesus did it. In the garden, he says, "Let this cup pass from me, but not my will, but your will be done." That's an immense thing of humility.
Mm-hmm.
And we know we have to surrender. We have to surrender lots of things. So, we surrender when we go to the gym. When you're on the squat rack, what are you doing? You're surrendering to the weight.
Mm-hmm.
And that weight takes you down and crushes you. But you also know it's that in that place is where you're also gaining strength.
Mm-hmm.
And we have to do that spiritually. We have to do that emotionally, socially, familially. We have to do it in our marriages. We have to do it in our friendships. So.
Yeah, I love that. So, it's interesting that you say that. Especially in our modern culture, I think something that a lot of men struggle with is our modern culture tells us that we can't be weak, that we can't be vulnerable, that we can't show weakness or we can't show vulnerability. Because if we do, women aren't going to respect us. We're not going to be desirable. So we can be struggling with things, but I think there's a lot of men that internalize that suffering that they're experiencing because, of course, we don't want to lose the respect of women or our children. So I think that puts a lot of pressure on men.
It does. And it's wrong. In other words, when our weakness, when we're willing to be able to show it and work against it, that's where respect comes from. If you act like you got it all together, you got nothing. Mm-hmm. And people see it too. Women can the guy with the stuffed shirts, the puffed up ego. There's a really great. I quote her often. Patsy Rodenberg is an acting coach that I have a lot of respect for. She talks about. She said there's 3 circles of energy. There's the first, the second, and the third circle. The first circle is that everything's turned in on themselves. This is the weakling, right? This is the one who's like, "Hi, how are you?" and very kind of doesn't have guts at all, right? Mm-hmm. That's easy to tell. But then there's third circle. Before we get to second, there's third, and third is that place where it's the dominating man. It's the here I am, look at me. It's Gaston in the Beauty and the Beast story. It was like, here I am, just the greatest thing ever. That also is a place of insecurity. Mm-hmm. Its second circle is the place of absolute presence. I'm present to you, you're present to me, but it also means I'm present to my weakness. I'm willing to show it, and at the same time, I don't allow it to overcome me. The first circle is it overcomes me. I'm crushed. I'm broken. Mm-hmm. This is something that I see, especially I've seen in a lot of young adults today, is this kind of victimization sensibility. It's like, well, these are all the things that happened to me, and they allow the weight of their experience to crush them, and they become convinced that they have no capability, or that they're completely inadequate. People see that. Mm-hmm. Nobody wants that, obviously. Women especially want a man who is present, but also present to his weakness and present to the things that need to be done in order to overcome it. Mm-hmm.
So the right way to be is in that second circle.
Yeah, and that's the place of presence. That's what we're doing right now, right? That we're present to each other, we're speaking to each other, we look at each other in the eyes, where we understand, but we also understand that we're weak men.
Right.
But what makes us strong is that we're battling against it. Mother Teresa said, God calls us to be faithful, not successful. We might not be successful in that fight, right? We might never overcome all of our weaknesses. We won't, as long as we're human beings with breath. Mm-hmm. But we will have. It's the fight. It's the faithfulness to the fight. Mm-hmm. That's what women want from a man.
Yeah, it's almost like in the 2 examples that you mentioned, it's like you have a state of crippling weakness, and then you have a state of false strength, right? So like if me and you are in conversation and I'm totally self-conscious about the way that I look or the way that I talk, sure. I'm not going to be engaged in a conversation with you. I'm really just thinking about myself. If
Yes.
if I'm trying to dominate, if I'm coming at you and trying to assert my agenda or whatever that may be, that's the other side of that. That's a false strength.
Right.
That's a persona that I'm trying to put on.
And you
but
see
either
it.
way, I'm outside of the ideal space, which is that of engagement with you.
Exactly.
And then to kind of bring that back to kind of modern men and online language, it's like you have the beta who is constantly walked all over, right?
Right.
Especially, and maybe even when it comes to women, like he has, can't stand up for himself or just doesn't have the ability to put on any strength, and he's just steamrolled by a woman or by anybody, really.
By life.
By life. But then you have kind of
He's steamrolled by himself first.
by himself for
Yeah,
sure.
I mean, he's already
and then,
lost.
And then getting steamrolled by other people is very easy.
Yeah.
Especially a woman. But then you have like kind of like the alpha personality, but I'm almost thinking someone along the lines of like an Andrew Tate, who's just like very, look at me, I am male perfection. You know what I mean? But what you're saying is that both of those personas or both of those states are not ideal.
No, they're not. And you're seeing this even, I think, amongst a lot of podcasters today that are kind of modern stoics. Stoicism has a lot of good things to it, but this idea is like I just have the will to overcome it, and there's no surrender there either. There's no sense of you can't overcome all your weaknesses, and it's in that place of I have to accept who I am. And it's in doing that people go, well, then I can accept you for who you are. And that means if you're accepting, then that means you're going to accept me for who I am. That's the place. That's the give and take of the present. And then what happens is an invitation. I invite you to come along with me on this journey, this adventure. I mean, all the great adventure stories are that, right? That especially the companion stories. I mean, both Sam and Frodo are weak hobbits. They have their excellences, but they also have their weaknesses. But it's the two of them being completely present to each other. That's why at the end of the story, towards the end of the story, Sam's great suffering is that Frodo can't be present to him. He's so weighed down by the ring. He's in another world. He's almost passed into the world of shadow, And that's the real tragedy there. And what we long for as men is that someone is going to be present to us, that we're going to be present to them. It's in doing that the women then respect men who do that. This is why women have, I think, they would like to have all the attention in a marriage, obviously, but at the same time, a truly healthy marriage, as women are like, go be with the guys. You're a better man when you're with them. Right.
Yeah, a very important aspect of a healthy marriage is, I think it goes both ways. The wife allowing the husband to have male friends, because there are things about male friendships that cannot be obtained through a marriage relationship between a man and a wife. But then vice versa, there are the man should also be letting his wife have her female friends.
Absolutely.
Because there are conversations and like chattiness that takes place that she can get with them that can't take place with her male, with her husband.
And there's things women can correct each other on that the man shouldn't. It's in the same way that there's things like we correct each other as men. I mean, I often see, they have the 5 love languages, but for men, there's 6 love languages, and mockery is the 6th love language.
Yeah, it definitely is.
I mean, you're good friends with someone when they can rip into you.
When you can make fun of each other. Yeah.
But what happens is when we banter back and forth like that, those are actually micro corrections. And so it's like someone might not turn and go like, Zach, you look like an idiot in that shirt, right? But they might be like, what's up, muscle guy? And then you might walk away with that and go, actually, it might be
I need to get longer shirts.
It's a good shirt. I'm joking with you.
I got this shirt because Casey told me that I needed to look bigger in shirts. I'm trying to impress my wife.
That's great. Hey, whatever she wants.
Oh, man. Yeah, I work out so, to keep her happy. No, I'm just kidding. I say it's for my health, but it's really so that I can impress my wife.
Actually, there's truth to that, but, we have to look, and for her to respect and to love you is part of you respecting and loving you. And for you to respect and love yourself and to be in good shape and things is the way in which you love her. So it's not a selfish act by any means. You know.
Yeah, there is I think what a lot of men struggle with is they don't understand that what a woman desires ultimately is, and I'll say first and foremost, a man of God. But when you peel the layers back on what a man of God is, like that's a man who is putting God first and not necessarily the woman or his wife first. And there's an attractiveness about that, to be God first and then what God wants from your life first, and then to have, and then your wife second, and then your children, if you have them, or your vocation. It's very important that you have. And what's most attractive to women is that a man has his priorities in proper order.
Well, she turns and says, okay, I mean, men and women are very aware of what they can provide. If a man is godless, he needs a God. I mean, we're made to worship. It's just you can argue it until the day is long, and whatever God it is, it's just that. But if we're not worshiping someone, we're going to worship ourselves. That's why the more atheistic world becomes, the more narcissistic the world becomes. Individuals. I mean, and when I see people whose marriages are failing, most of the time, someone will say, well, she's a narcissist or he's a narcissist. Now, but the thing is that a lot of times they're right. That comes out of this: if I'm not worshiping God, then I'm worshiping something else. That something else often will be myself, right? When the man's wife sees, it's like, wow, this is a man of God. Good, thank God. I don't have to be God. I don't have to be his false God, because that puts a lot of pressure on a woman, right? To be something she's not.
Right.
And that's a source of anxiety for women very often. I often say that the two most detrimental things that take place in a marriage is an emotionally absent father and an anxious mother. And the female anxiety very often comes from the fact that he's not available. He's not emotionally available. He's not being a man in the family, which means, and he's not giving my children and myself what we need. So now I have to not only be the woman in the relationship, I have to be the man in the relationship. I have to provide my children with everything. And that causes an immense amount of anxiety. And you'd be amazed when I say things like this in talks for women. They're all like, yeah. Just big nods, like, yes, thank you for saying it. A man of God who is striving for a relationship with God, then it places all other things in their proper relationship. Places him in his proper place. It places his wife or girlfriend or whatever it might be in a proper place. Places friendships in the proper place. Places his children in the proper place. And probably most importantly, work. Work doesn't become God. So, and I would say whatever God you worship, I mean, yes, of course, I believe in one God. But you'll see this amongst people of other religions and other faiths, right, as well. There's that element of God in us that defines and delimits everything.
All right, well, speaking of being a man of God, and if we can only find God by going into the darkness, by going into the suffering, why is that the place to find him? How can we find God in our suffering? And is there an aspect of, like, why does God need us to suffer to find him?
That's a good question. He doesn't need us to suffer. Suffering is part of the human experience now because of sin. We're fallen, we're weak. Weakness causes pain, causes suffering, causes us to cause suffering. Suffering's there. Jesus didn't come to take away suffering. He came to give it meaning. Because to take away suffering would be to take away human freedom. To take away human freedom would be to take away the capacity for love. Because you can't force someone to love you. You can only invite them to. So our condition is pain and suffering. So he says, okay, I'm going to come and give it meaning. And the way I'm going to give it meaning is I'm going to take it all on. I'm going to take it all on. I'm going to sink into the deepest place. There's a wonderful moment not only in the Garden of Gethsemane, but Jesus is arrested on Holy Thursday night. And he's brought to Caiaphas' house, the high priest, which is right across the Kidron Valley. And there he's thrown into the, they're beating him and they're mocking him and they're doing all these things and they're trying to figure out the best way to destroy him. And that night they throw him into the pit. Now it's interesting. It was a water cistern that was in the high priest's house. And at the period of time of Jesus, it wasn't used as a water cistern. It was used as a prison for things like this. And Jesus is thrown into this pit. And you go into that pit today. And it's amazing to know that you're kneeling on the same floor that Jesus knelt on and was alone in the middle of the night, knowing what was going to happen the next day on Good Friday. And he goes into that. I was there in that place, and I just started crying. It was like every suffering, every traumatic experience, every inadequacy, every fear, everything was like brought to that place, and Jesus was there, and he was there before me. He went to that place before me, but that place wasn't just a physical space in a prison. That's my heart. And so to avoid that place would be to avoid Jesus. And so he says, come. He says way before that, he says, come, all you are labor and burdened, and I will give you rest. He's going to go into that place. My yoke is easy and my burden is light. What does that mean? Give me your yoke. Give me your burden. Give me this darkness. Give me this thing that's crushing you, and I will take it, and I will make it my own. And whatever I make my own, that is the place of redemption. That is the place of encounter. You'll meet me there. And we know this as men. Who are the men that we're usually closest to? It's the men that we've suffered with. We few, we happy few, we band of brothers. For he today who gives his life, sheds his blood with me, shall be my brother. Be he near so vile, this day will gentle his condition. And gentlemen in England now abed will think themselves accursed they were not here, and hold their manhoods cheap, whilst any who fought with us upon St. Crispin's Day. It's the great moment of Henry V. And he says before that, he says, someday these men will strip their sleeves and show their scars and say, these wounds I had on Crispin's Day. In other words, it's the men that we're willing to go into the dark place with, the band of brothers of war, the guys that we went to the championship game with, and it was, we had to crush it. I remember playing football as a freshman in high school, and those guys, we didn't have a lot in common oftentimes, but when you're doing 2-a-days for all of August, and or at least it felt like it was all of August, probably a week, but and you're going through that suffering, you're playing those games and you're being injured next to each other, you go into that dark place, whether you like it or not, and those are the guys that you're closest to. Mm-hmm. Well, Jesus knows that, of course, because he's a man, and he says, and he's God, and so he says, this is going to be par excellence, our relationship. If you go there, it's because I'm already there. Mm-hmm. This is the way you show me your love, mm-hmm. is by going to the place I already am. Mm-hmm. And in that place, I will show you my love. Mm-hmm. But I'll also show you my redemption and my victory over that suffering. Mm-hmm. And that's an important thing I have to say. We have to go into the darkness, but it doesn't stay dark. Right?
I think it's really important that you say that, because, especially us as Catholics, I think we can almost get like caught up in the suffering, caught up in the darkness. Mm. Whereas like the Protestants will turn around and say like, no, Jesus rose from the dead. How do we deal with that kind of dichotomy, that it's a paradox, right?
Yeah, I mean, the paradox in that, my experience of most non-Catholic Christians is that everyone understands it and everyone feels it and they're experiencing it. But we say, Jesus has already done the work for me. But you're still playing it out. Right. Why? Because I live in time. I'm a creature of time, which means that I make a decision to follow Jesus Christ as my personal Lord and Savior. And I receive the redemption of the cross, but then I have to play that out over time. In the same way that a man stands at the altar and he turns to his bride and says, I promise to be faithful to you in good times and in bad, in sickness and in health. I will love you and honor you all the days of my life. That's not a one-time and forever thing. Everyone who's married for more than 15 minutes knows that, right? That I made that decision now, and I, as a creature in time, have to make that decision over and over and over to accept the gift that was given. Yes, he died. Yes, he was redeemed, that he redeemed us. And it's a both and. And I live that each moment of my life. And we know that in every other relationship. Right.
Well, it's almost like a version of the prosperity gospel. It's like, if I accept Jesus as my Lord and Savior and I, live according to this way, nothing bad is ever going to happen to me again. It's almost
that's and everyone knows that's not true.
Everyone, and it can't be, right? Because like the suffering and the darkness that we experience, it has to be a part of it along the way. Yeah. And it seems as though God uses that to prune us, to allow us to grow and be better versions of ourselves. So we have to go into the suffering. We have to go into the darkness. It's not just a matter of, no, once we start living this way of life, things are always just going to be better for us. Like, that's not how it works. Obviously, I mean, you see the lives of the saints.
Well, they'll
and
be better
much
in that
darkness and suffering they went through.
Yeah.
Right. But they did it with God.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know. It's hard to say that it's a prosperity gospel type of thing, but it's almost like an I deserve good things if I am walking along this path. It seems to me, I mean, I know that I can think this way sometimes, and it seems to me there are a lot of, I guess you can say, Christians that think this way.
Well, I think we can think that way. People can easily accept that and think that way, but reality proves that it's not true. Mm-hmm. I mean, everybody continues to suffer. This is why the prosperity gospel preachers rarely have people that are following them for their whole life, because it's like, what's going on? Mm-hmm. I'm still suffering and I'm doing everything you tell me to do. Mm-hmm. I mean, then a lot of people walk away from Jesus then and just say, well, it's a joke.
It doesn't work.
Right. But to be able to say, well, we want to suffer. I mean, there's part of us that wants that. I mean, anyone who goes to the gym every day knows that, right? It's like, I submit myself to difficulty. Mm-hmm. Artists know that. Mm-hmm. I mean, I paint, and people say, have you painted anything lately? And I said, no, I haven't done anything lately because I've been so happy. I'm like, what are you talking about? And I go, well, but it's when the darkness comes where you have to contend with it. Yeah. And that's where creativity is drawn out. That's why the most creative people are often sometimes the most suffering people, I mean, the great artists were people that were willing to go there.
Right.
We want that. And we need that. We want to do it in a mitigated fashion so it's not misery. Suffering is not the problem. How we approach the problem is the problem. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. With regard to the entrepreneur, the artist, the creator, like, there's so much, I guess you can say, there's so much fruit that comes out of the pain and out of the suffering. It's like they do their best work when they're like in their worst times, or when they need it the most, right? It's like all of the best work that artists do, for the most part, like when we talk about musicians, I talk about this with U2 a lot, but like their best stuff is from the 90s when they were hungry and they didn't have anything and they were poor, right? Yeah. Once they got rich, all of their stuff is meh, and I feel like there's a lot of artists and a lot of entrepreneurs, that's the case for them as well.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's what you're going to see. I think that's the reason Taylor Swift keeps dating different guys. She needs to suffer every couple of years to make a better album.
I've said that if Taylor Swift gets married and has kids and has a happy life, gone. She's not going to be good anymore.
She had nothing to talk about.
That's right. That's right. She needs the drama, and the drama is what makes her really, really good.
Exactly. Yeah. No, it's I mean, we need it. We need it in a mitigated fashion. I mean, look at marriage. I mean, it's the moments where you have the arguments are also the moments of greatest intimacy sometimes afterwards, if the heart is open to the other person.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's also too like a nostalgia, and like we get pleasure from thinking about hard times and thinking about going through hard times with, whether it be like a band of brothers like you mentioned, or even like our spouse. Like, my wife and I have been, dating and been together since we were 15 years old, but there were certainly some hard times along the way, but, and it hasn't been perfect, but the fact that we've gotten over hard times together, like we've been broke together, we've been, and we look back at those times and we're like, gosh, like it has strengthened our love and our relationship now.
Yeah. Well, it's those T-shirts, "Stay hungry." Mm-hmm. I mean, there's something to it. Actually, I mean, we're finding this today is the number of people. Look, we have an unprecedented period of history that we're living in, of unprecedented peace. Never in the history of the world has there been, for a country, as much peace as we've had and comfort, you know, since World War II. And even in World War II, like, people made sacrifices, but it was the people in the United States, there wasn't as much suffering. I mean, once the Great Depression ended, and we've had all this peace, and then what happens is you have, in the midst of all of this blasted comfort, people are looking for, look how awful my life is. I'm suffering. This is where the victim complexes come from. This is why Marxism is so attractive today, is because it's this, I have to find somebody to blame for this little bit of misery. And rather than taking the misery on and making it into this fertile place of amazing success and creativity and entrepreneurial spirit and all these things, is people are wallowing in this. They're wallowing in the darkness, pitying themselves.
What is the saying? The saying goes that easy times make weak men.
Weak men, yeah.
Weak men make hard times. Hard times make strong men. Strong men make easy times, or something along those lines. Yeah.
I mean, if there's a cycle, it's not the Marxist dialectic. It's that. Right. I mean, the Great Generation, if you want to call them that, was the Great Generation because of the Great Depression. They suffered.
Right. Yeah, there was a lot of suffering there.
So we can either wait for it to come to us, or we can allow ourselves to accept the darkness that's there, the difficulty that's there, to be able to embrace it, to find Christ in the midst of it. Right? Or we can wait for it to come to us.
Yeah. You've given 3 main triggers of anxiety: dread, regret, and complaining. Take us through those and what they do to us.
Yeah. Well, this is an interesting thing. When we look, our brain is made to protect us first. And if I am looking at life as an opportunity, this is the way we're meant to. It's an opportunity. This is great. What's the opportunity in this moment? What happens is our brain, our neoventral prefrontal cortex, our higher reasoning kicks in, and it's like, this is awesome, right? But when we don't do that, what happens is that the other part of our brain, our fight or flight, our amygdala, kicks in. This is where anxiety comes from mostly. That regret or the rumination on the past is what happens is we see the past as a threat. Or we see that looking towards the future as a potential threat. And so there's this fear. Anxiety is merely a response to fear. Sometimes we need that, and it's an incredibly important thing, right? I was telling a story yesterday. I was at a senior home, and there were a lot of people who were suffering there. It's a rehab facility as well, so you have people of all different ages who are really rehabilitating from accidents, cancer, all these other things, and then you have people who are elderly and are just needing more of a hospital location. And the gospel reading was really about, it's letting go. And I told a story that maybe you've heard that, maybe I've told you this story before. I used to work for the circus, and one day I was walking through Madison Square Garden, and I'm walking. I have my laptop over my shoulder, and I got a watermelon under my other arm because that's what elephants like. And I'm reading a newspaper, kind of like juggling with these things. And I'm walking. This is back when you read newspapers, and I'm walking and walking and walking. It's backstage of the garden, and all of a sudden, poof, and I hit something, and I'm like, what did I just kick? That feels weird. It's kind of fleshy. And I moved the newspaper, and I looked down, and I kicked Zusha, the queen of the Nile, a 5,000-pound hippopotamus, right in the mouth, right in the face. And I'm like, I just stop and look down, and I'm like, please don't make a reaction. And she just starts getting up, and this giant head comes and looks at me, and I'm like, and the big buggy eyes of a hippopotamus, and I'm like, and I drop the laptop, and I drop the, and I throw the watermelon, and the newspaper goes flying up in the air, and I start running, just running. Now, hippopotami, most people don't know this, run at about 30 miles per hour.
They can run you down.
They can run me down.
They're dangerous.
I cannot run at 30 miles per hour. And most people, it's like, I think it's like one of the highest casualty rates of animal death because of animal or hippopotamus, And so I'm running, and I'm thinking to myself, choice words of fear, right? And my amygdala is lit up because I'm about to die. And I'm also thinking, what's this phone call going to be like to my mother? Mrs. Searby, we're sorry to tell you, but your son was killed by a hippopotamus on 34th Street in Manhattan. I mean, it'd be a great story, right? So I'm running and I'm thinking. So I'm
you
like,
said it would be a great story.
I mean, it's if you're gonna go, right? If you're gonna go, I mean, that's something. But
true.
and I'm and I'm running, you know, and it's I was able to jump behind this thing, and the hippo was ramming it, and I remembered the word that the trainer used to get her to open her mouth, and so in my best accent, my best Russian accent, I scream out this word, and sure enough, she opened her mouth, and she thinks she's in the show now. Mm-hmm. And then they pulled her off. And, you know, the trainer ran up. He was so apologetic. I'm so sorry this happened. The baboons that used to dance on her back are like, and, you know, like screaming and yelling.
But like egging her on.
Egging her on. Yeah, it's like you're evil. Baboons are just evil. Quiet, you evil monkey. But as this was taking place, my amygdala was in full function. Mm-hmm. That's important to have that ability there. But most of the time we don't have that. Most of the time we're not facing lions and hippopotami. And so what happens is this idea of suffering. A lot of times it's like we look for suffering. We look back on the past, and it's never with clear vision. They say, you know, looking back always gives you 20/20 vision. That's not true. Because most of the time it's highly biased by our baggage and our pains, our difficulties, our egos, whatever it might be, our pride. And so looking back, when we're living in the past, we should have an awareness of the past. It's the reason I have a degree in history, so I wouldn't argue that. If we forget our past, we're bound to repeat it, as they say. But when we live in the past, it's always grim, right? So our amygdala gets lit up. Then if we're looking towards the future from that place, we're looking to the future with the possibility of more pain. So we're going to be afraid of everything. The one place we're not is in the present. And it's as my brother, who's a psychologist, says. He says, you know, it's the reason they call it a present is because it's a gift. You know, and we miss what's happening right here. Okay, when we're living from that place of the amygdala, what happens is very interesting, just neurologically. You have the shock of adrenaline that runs into your amygdala from your experience, whether you're the experience of something deadly or your ruminations and your dreads. When the amygdala lights up, that adrenaline can only go to one of two places, but it can't go to both. So you can't have the adrenaline giving a shock to your higher reasoning, to your prefrontal cortex. So what happens is your higher reasoning shuts down. And that's why people who are living in that place of anxiety, that place of fear, you can't be creative. There's no reason to be creative. There's no reason to create and think higher thoughts and things if you're probably going to die, you know.
Right.
So we live in this place of fear. And one of the things that causes the fear the most is complaining. If I complain, what happens is I send a shock to my brain saying, you perceive a threat, which is going to shut down the creativity. It's going to make me more ADHD in my way of approaching things. Why? Because when there's fear, you're looking everywhere for things. This is not healthy. I would say that many people have suffered traumas. Many people have suffered difficulties, real strong difficulties, and they have to contend with those. But a lot of the anxiety problems that we have today are because of complaining. That we're looking for threats and we're going to find them. And you can tell when you talk about the kind of toxic people you want to stay away from. The people who are poisonous to a situation, the people who complain. Gossip's another form of complaining, right? And what happens is that poisons the possibility of the present. So what do? We have to kill complaining. Like literally just stop complaining. And I think especially as men, it's not masculine to complain. I mean, it's not feminine to complain either, but it's because women should be a fertile place of hope, you know. But as men, when we complain, it shuts down our ability to react in a healthy way. I love that moment in The Lord of the Rings where, you know, everything's just the walls are about to be breached, you know, and Gimli looks and he's like, you know, possibility of death, chance of success little. What are we waiting for? You know, it's just diving in. That's an opportunity mindset. And we see that. You know, Carol Dweck writes her book about, you know, the growth mindset. So there's the growth mindset is one that's looking for opportunity, right? And that activates the brain, it activates the spirit. But then that stagnant kind of anxiety-ridden mind, that's the complaining mindset. So you see a kid that comes to school. It's interesting, you know. I see little kids, you know, it's at the school. They come to school, and usually by like up from pre-K to fourth grade, you see them, especially the first day of school, but even every day. And they come in, they got their big backpack. They're like, "This is awesome! I got all these things I get to do." And all of a sudden, in fifth grade, somewhere along the line, they start to hear that, because now they're in the upper part of the school. They hear the older kids or their parents complaining about things. So now school stops becoming this opportunity for learning and play. And actually, I would argue that school should be an opportunity for play and learning. Is now they start to see it. And by the way, usually at about fourth grade, the play stops. And then we tell kids they have to sit in the classroom more and sit and memorize things and stuff. We've destroyed our children that way. And what happens is that usually at about fifth grade, they start complaining. Oh, I got a test. I got to do this thing. This is ridiculous. My teacher gave me the homework assignment. My gosh, I can't. And what happens is that's where the anxiety is growing from with our young people.
Especially boys, too, in a classroom setting, because, you know, perhaps not every boy was made to sit in a classroom for X hours a day.
Absolutely.
So that when the boy can't sit still, he's then looked upon as if something's wrong with him.
He's a dysfunctional
he's
girl.
Diagnosed with some type of disorder, and he's given, you know,
Drugs.
a lot of boys are given some type of medication to calm him down so that he can conform to the classroom setting. Yeah. I mean,
how many people have we, how many entrepreneurs, how many creative people, how many inventors, how many explorers have we destroyed? Because we've made them all sit in a factory setting, and we've lined them up. We line them up in a factory and go, you're grade A, you're grade B, you're grade C. Right? And then we judge them according to one criteria, and we stamp them and we send them out into the world. You know, just like meat in a factory. How many have we destroyed? So many.
So many. And how many creatives, entrepreneurs who likely don't do that well in school? How many of them think they're stupid or think that they don't have what it takes when in fact they probably really do?
Oh, yeah.
They were just put in the wrong.
I believe
that. They were a fish outside of water.
I believe this. One of my biggest experiences of anxiety was that I was awful at math. I mean, awful. I can't add. Nothing. I remember, and it's probably learned helplessness. You know, maybe I probably would have been good at high mathematics or something. But at a young age, I learned that I was not good at math. I had teachers that would say that. So it was a true thing. I couldn't sit still because I had a lot of creative energy. And for years, I believed I was an idiot. Even though I'm giving talks and I have degrees and I'm doing all these things, it's like I believed that I was stupid because of that. How many guys believe that? You know, you see boys, they get so defeated so easily.
I think there are a lot of boys who think that they're stupid because of their performance in the classroom setting. And I think there are a lot of boys that they're told they're stupid by their peers, by girls, by their parents, because they don't perform well in the classroom.
Or they're not told that, but the awards and the accolades are going to the kids.
They notice
the
themselves.
Good kid. And it's interesting because the kid that always got the straight A's was really great. They're probably going to be
they're going to be a great employee.
Yeah, they're going to be a great employee. Exactly.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, that's
what the world wants, right? The world wants subservient employees that do their, I'm not going to shake things up.
That's right.
Right. And why do people love people like Steve Jobs and Elon Musk? And because they did the exact opposite. They completely revolutionized industries, multiple industries.
Yeah. So. Yeah, I mean, a lot of my content has to do with focusing on your God-given purpose, and especially most of what men are looking for, the adventure in their life, the strength to, battle the storms, battle the enemy, the world, the flesh, the devil that seems to constantly be trying to destroy us. The way to make yourself attractive to a woman and gain a wife and gain a family that you can, provide and protect the way to do that, the way to get that is to take on, or is to recognize and then take on your God-given purpose, and to be almost, and I think not to criticize the Catholic Church, but I don't think the church stresses to be almost entrepreneurial about pursuing your God-given purpose. It's like we need on fire, Catholic doctors, lawyers, athletes, artists, musicians, entrepreneurs, small business owners, priests, mothers, fathers. It's like we need to invade the culture through all of these ways. We need saints in all of these areas of life.
Totally. I will say that I think the church is doing a really good job at that, because you're part of the church.
True.
The church is not the hierarchy of priests that are preaching from a pulpit.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
I mean, you have a bigger pulpit than I do. Well, that's maybe, I don't know if that's true, because I have the podcast too.
Your podcast, maybe. We'll
I mean,
compare numbers later.
No, I'm sure you win. But this is this is the whole thing. The way of things is that the church is everybody. We have people everywhere. That's what I love. It's like we have those that are, we have a friend of mine's in the Navy, and he's on an aircraft carrier, and we got to speak. He goes, well, I can't say what port we're in. And I go, well, it's really hard to miss an aircraft carrier. Like, that's the whole point, right? It's projection of power. And I think in some ways, like the priests, we're pretty obvious. You walk down the street and say, but then we have the incursion forces and the complete undercover agents and all these things are the normal everyday people who are out there, and you're one of them. Mm-hmm. So I think that the church is doing a brilliant job in that. Mm-hmm. Maybe it needs to be preached more about that. Perhaps the church has fallen into, yes, it has, in some ways have fallen into kind of a corporate model, especially in the United States. And perhaps the church as a whole has fallen into a kind of educational paradigm that mirrors the world. And I think we need to be thinking outside the box way more. And it's not that we have to recreate education. We just have to rediscover what was lost by the post-Enlightenment industrial age educational system. Mm-hmm.
And I think it's important that you say that, and it's important that you make that distinction with regard to what the church is, because the church is not just the church that you go to on Sunday,
building, right?
Or it's not just the building. It's not just the school.
Yeah.
If you go to a Catholic school that you go to, it's something that exists throughout all of the world and all of society.
It's a family. It's an organism, and
it's an organism
everywhere. Yeah, it's not a. Think of it like a family. That's how the early church was. I think actually some of the Protestant criticisms of the church is to see that, like, there's this immense amount of community in a lot of small Protestant communities, right?
Yes, they're very good at that.
Yeah. And this that's the early church was that. Mm-hmm. So we need to have that all the time, and it means that we're always the Catholic Church is always in the process of reform. Mm-hmm. That we're always reforming. So it's like, it's the same way. You might really focus on the exercise, but then you realize I got to dial in the diet, and then you got the diet and the exercise, and I got to dial in. I got to finish that book. I got to do a book a month. So we're always like the self-improvement, and that's always a process of reform. Mm-hmm. It's the same kind of thing with an organism or a family, right? We're always searching for homeostasis, but we're not gonna achieve it,
right? Well, I just think that's really important. I think especially for young men to know, because there are, in a world where, men and young men are suffering to find meaning and purpose and identity. The church does have what they're looking for. Mm-hmm. They find it in vocation and God-given purpose, but they're a very meaningful adventure for men is to take on that cross, take on that God-given purpose, take on that vocation, and go and do and be in the world to use all that they have, use all of their talents and interests in these various areas of the world to win souls and build up the church.
Yes.
And you can do that. And the way to be a saint is not necessarily just to be a priest or just to be
absolutely.
a nun.
I mean, this is the whole message of Saint Josemaria Escrivá and Opus Dei,
I love his stuff. Yeah.
where they were meant to be saints in the middle of the world. Whether you're a lawyer or a policeman or a artist or a university professor, it doesn't matter, right? Is that or a father, a mother, a student? We're called to be a canonizable saint, and it's doing the little things extraordinarily well. It's the little way of Saint Therese meets the world, meets the street. That's what I love about Opus Dei is you take the little way, you take all these great moments in spirituality, and you throw them in the street and say, go live it there.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where we're meant to be. I mean, the monastery of today is the street.
Mm-hmm.
The monastery today is the classroom and the it's the place where we become contemplatives in the boardroom and the sports field.
Mm-hmm.
We're contemplatives in the middle of the world, and that's what men have to be. And it's very passionate. It's very masculine.
Yeah,
to be out there.
Yeah, and I found that especially in my own life, like as it relates to anxiety and suffering and mental health, that vocation and that purpose that I get, starting with life in the proper order with God, and then for me, marriage, and then my kids, and then work. I mean, that provides me with a pretty strong, it's an extremely strong foundation in this world where storms do come. And I found it just to be, solid ground, I guess you can say, when it comes to having to deal with, anxiety and suffering when it does come. And I think that it's a route that, in my opinion, I believe that we were all made to pursue, that you must pursue if you want to bring yourself out of, we talk about the dread, the regret, the complaining that can go on in this life. Like that's a way to get yourself out of it.
Yeah, and that's something that I think maybe, language is important. I can't get myself out of things. I think this is an important thing. It's easy for us, and maybe some of our Protestant brothers and sisters have a good critique of this in just the language we use. It's very American for us to say this, is that I save myself, that I pull myself out of it. That's not true. I don't. Jesus saves me. I have to work with him, and working with him means I have to face it. This is back to Gethsemane. This is going into the garden in the dark place. If someone's struggling with anxiety, it's like, look, if I'm living in a state of constant fear, I've tried to save myself in that. I've tried to pull myself out, and I can't. So I have to, rather than falling into fear, I have to fall into my family. I have to fall into my vocation. I have to fall into my work. I have to fall into living a healthy lifestyle, right? If not for myself, for somebody else, right? I often tell people this. We talk about self-care. Self-care is other care. You care about other people, then make sure you're taking care of yourself, because they love you too. And they deserve a healthy version of yourself to be loved by you, right? But it is important that we don't fall into being Pelagians, where it's this kind of like self-salvation, right? I'm not meriting salvation. I'm working with the salvation that's given.
Mm-hmm. How do you find the fine line between what we have to do as individuals and almost letting go and trusting God take care? Like can you get into a little bit of the self-care that we are responsible for versus like taking it too far and how that takes place?
Yeah, well, it starts with him. If I start with my own activity, then I'm going to go down the wrong way. So I begin with him. This is why prayer is absolutely imperative, the first thing. It's the primary thing. It's the first thing. It orients me. If my dial is always pointing true north, if I am looking at him as my Lord, then I'm receiving from him first. I'm receiving in prayer, right? Then, by his prompting and by trust in divine grace, I can go do the things I need to do. I can go do the self-care. I can take care of my family. I can serve my church. I can do all those other things. But the love of the Lord your God first is there's a reason why it's the commandment is an order of importance, right? And so I love the Lord my God first. Then I'm able to love myself with the love received, and then I'm able with that love received and the self-love that I have, the proper self-love, the humble self-love. Then I can go love other people. It's this trickle-down effect like that. So the first is our orientation has to be towards Him. Then what do? Well, now I have a peace, and so I'm able to act according to that peace. The peace that He gives me. I can't generate for myself, that He gives me. And that's going to take off a lot of pressure, because I think a lot of anxiety comes out that if I'm making if it's all my effort, I'm making myself in effect God. I know I'm not. And so that's scary as hell. That's terrifying. And that terror, and you hear people say this now, don't you? People say, that was agonizing. It was terrifying. And I'm like, well, careful using those words, because if you say those words, there's not many words stronger than that, right? If everything is terrifying, what's going to happen when something really is terrifying? What word are you going to use?
Right.
But if I'm God and I have to save myself, then that is terrifying. And that is where a lot of anxiety comes from.
Yeah, and that's interesting, because it seems like that need for God and that need for God for human beings psychologically is obviously very important. And I mean, we're living in a time right now where, like, mental health in America is at, basically an all-time low.
Yeah.
And Americans are receiving more mental health care than ever before. Yet we are seeing the poorest mental health outcomes than ever before.
Yeah.
We have 1 in 5 people that are on some form of mental health medication. Suicide and drug overdose deaths are at all-time highs. And interestingly, the psychology field has the highest percentage of atheists than any other medical field. Why is God such an important aspect of our psychology?
Oh yeah, well, first we're made by Him, so it's our source is Him. But I would say that we're creatures. I think modern man has forgotten this, that we're animals. That we have reason and free will and all those things, but we are creatures. Creatures are immensely limited. God is important because I need to be able to understand first, and this is healthy psychology has always been this. The first work of psychology in Western literature, Western intellect, the Western intellect was the Confessions of St. Augustine. I mean, you'd be hard-pressed to find somebody who has more sense of both positive and negative psychology, right, in that. And what is Augustine first, as he says, late have I loved thee, Lord, late have I loved thee. O beauty ever ancient, ever new, late have I loved thee. For I searched for you from without, and I found myself lacking. This is a very rough translation. I found myself lacking. But it was you who were within. So to be able to understand that my place of encounter is from within, that God, there's an indwelling, especially in the baptized. Once I'm baptized, I have an indwelling of the Trinity within me. That the Father is a provider. It's interesting, we talk about like how women want a man who is a provider and a protector. Well, that's the aspect of us that we're made in the image and likeness of as men, right? And we're all made in the image and likeness of God, and the way we reflect as men God is by being protector and provider first, right? But I also know I'm not a protector and I'm not a provider, okay? Which means I need God to do it. The original sin was to provide for myself, right? Adam and Eve, they provide for themselves. What was the original temptation? The father is not a good father. He's not going to provide for you. You have to provide for yourself. That's when they fall to the temptation. We keep falling to that, the self-provision. Now, okay, so we're made by God, for God. We know that there's a divine. We know that there's this sense of divinity is important, because even the greatest of atheists spend all of their time arguing that He doesn't exist. It's like, you think about God more than I do. You just say that He's not there, right? Why is it that psychology? This is a complex thing. Why are there so many atheists in psychology? Well, this is post-Freudian psychology. Freud was an atheist. And Freud also killed himself. Freud gave up. Why? Because I think he discovered he wasn't God. His God, he had an obsession with mythology and things like this. He was kind of looking at all the images of God. I think he forgot he was made in his image as well. And because of that, when faced with suffering, he despaired. I hope I'm not judging his soul. Again, I can only judge from what I see, But post-Freud, there's this kind of atheistic sense. I think we've made psychology God. And then we can figure all these things out. The interesting thing about psychology is because it's a pseudoscience. Science and the scientific method requires you to be able to experiment and have test subjects and to be able to have sets of people and whatever the experiment is outside of the norm that are your controls and things. Well, we don't have that in psychology. We also can't see what the final aspect of the psychology is. We can only experiment in certain ways. So the scientific method is very limited when it comes to the human mind, because I can also only be able to judge based on how people express things, right? So I don't know if my psychological theory is working all the time. And part of science is you want to universalize things. You can't universalize things with human beings. We're too paradoxical. There's too many unknowns. Mm-hmm. So you can't have a control subject. Mm-hmm. Okay. So, but what happens is that psychology, when you're practicing it, it is easy to get a God complex. Because you're getting in there the deep, As a priest, I'm not a psychologist, but I'm getting in deep. You hear confessions and you counsel people, and people are just spilling out the stuff, And that's why it's so important for a priest to have a deep prayer life. Because when you start seeing successes, oh my gosh, that really helped me and it changed my life, and it's easy to have a God complex. And a lot of psychologists have said that, A lot of sense it's like I'm playing God in these things. So I think there's a confusion. I think there's a post-enlightenment, sola ratio, It's interesting, the Protestant Reformation or Revolution or whatever you want to call it, it was sola scriptura, sola fidei, only scripture, only faith. Mm-hmm. Well, the Enlightenment made it sola ratio, only reason, and we threw away the scripture part. So it's all reason. The thing is that now science has become unreasonable. Why? Because it's lost its grounding. What is the grounding of all science? It is God. When you lose that, and Jordan Peterson explains this brilliantly, when you lose that, you're left to be your own God.
I think he calls science Christian.
No, science is absolutely Christian.
Yeah.
Absolutely Christian. The scientific method is invented by a Catholic priest.
It's the study of the logos.
Logic. Of the logic, of the truth.
The intelligence of the universe.
That's it.
It's a study of Christ.
The universe is intelligible because it comes from an intelligence.
Right.
Yeah, so it's a study in Christ. So every scientist I think a lot of psychologists lose that. Not all of them. There's a lot of really good ones, the really grounded ones, of all different faiths. It's kind of, okay, there's a God. I'm not God. You're not God. I can't fully heal myself. I have to submit Alcoholics Anonymous to my higher power, whatever that higher power is, and then you can really do the work of healing. The people who, I find, in my experience at least, the people who reject God can have as much psychology as they want. They're never going to find healing.
It's interesting to think about Alcoholics Anonymous as being extremely effective in people's lives. Yes. And you see the modern, almost secular psychotherapy results as being fairly poor.
Yeah.
How is psychotherapy, how can it be effective without God?
Well, I don't think it can ultimately. I mean, you can get people talking.
Which can help to some extent.
Yeah, when you get people talking and then they start asking the real questions. And when people start asking the real questions, it's inevitably going to lead them to God. Or despair. There's only two choices. You have God or nothing. Right? Nietzsche opines on this all the time. So I think that we need we need to have that as part. And that's why psychology that has God as part of it, or at least a sense of a higher power, is going to be much more successful in it, because it humbles you.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
You've been open about therapy that you've received, years of therapy you've said that you've received, but said that one session with an exorcist changed your life.
Yeah, it was a deliverance from those. You know, it's some anxiety and things are it's oppression. So I wasn't possessed, don't worry, but it was a sense of there were spirits that knew how to get to me. They knew my weak points, and they were just pressing on them, lying to them. A lot of the psychological problems we have are lies we believe. And, you know, you say that Satan is the father of lies, right? And so it can lie and things like that. And we believe those lies, and we become trapped in those lies. And so we need to be liberated from those lies. And Jesus Christ is the liberation. And there are those that have, certain people have, you know, it's all priests in general, and particularly people, some priests are given, you know, the authority as exorcists to be able to command those spirits to leave. We can, by our baptismal, you know, I can reject, in the name of Jesus, I renounce the spirit of anxiety. In the name of Jesus, I renounce the spirit of fear. I command you to leave. I don't want you. You know, you can break your agreement with them and stay. But then when that person with authority, and we need that, we need people with authority, right? In the same way that, you know, if I could walk up to you and go, Zach, you're under arrest. Well, I don't have the authority to do that. But if I was a police officer, I walk up and I go, Zach, you're under the guy with the authority. That changes your reality. Right. So that this priest prayed over me, and it was like God showed up. It was one of the most powerful experiences I've ever had in my life of absolute peace, absolute love. He just commanded them to leave, and they left. And you've experienced, people who struggle from anxiety experience, it's like the voices, you know, it's not the voices of a schizophrenic, but it's the voices of the lies, you know, that we believe. And it's, you're not good enough. You're not safe. You're a disappointment. You're stupid. You're all these things, right? Those lies are usually very simple. And God's going to be quite, you know, he's going to be specific. The liar is never specific. It's always like there's a no-win scenario, and they're lies we believe, and we start to identify with those lies. We appropriate the lies unto ourselves as though it's our own voice when it's not. And then we often need liberation from that. Right.
How do you distinguish between what is psychological and what's spiritual?
We can't fully.
It's so entangled.
We're complex. We're human beings. Human beings are spiritual, and they are psychological, and they are physical, right? Now there are some things that you can tell. You know, you can say, okay, well that sounds like the liar. The way you tell is by trying it. Right? Let me say this prayer. Mm-hmm. How are you feeling? What's going on? Right. The same with the psychology. Try this. Did that help? Yes. Did it help? No. Right. There's some people who go to psychology constantly, and it's like they say, I'm not experiencing any peace from this. It seems to be this constant battle. Then go see a priest and have the priest pray over them. Right.
Yeah.
St. James says this is the basis of the sacrament of the anointing of the sick. We read in sacred scripture, are there people sick among you? Then let them send for the priests of the church, and let the priest pray over them, anointing them with oil in the name of the Lord. The prayer of faith will save the sick persons, and the Lord will raise them up. If they have committed any sins, their sins will be forgiven them. There's something, go submit yourself, go show yourself to the priest, and have him pray over you. Right. That's very important. And any priest can do it. Once in a while, there's some heavy gun stuff that only those who are highly trained and have been given that particular authority can deal with.
Right.
People go, well, how do I know? I go get therapy. First, go get therapy. Throw yourself into it. Right. Before therapy, go talk to a good friend that you trust. A lot of people don't need therapy. They need someone to love them. Mr. Rogers used to say this. He said, who have you loved into being? Who has loved you into being? Many people don't need a psychologist. Many people need a friend who really loves them into being, who's going to be there for them, is going to listen to them, someone who's wise, maybe someone who's older, or someone who has wisdom, a particular wisdom, right?
It's interesting that you had mentioned Freud, who was an atheist, and he's considered, the father of modern psychology, especially, I would say, atheistic or secular psychology, psychotherapy. There's a story about Freud that is pretty interesting, and I'll tell you the story, and then I'll tell you how it relates to me personally, and probably relates to you as well. But one of Freud's colleagues actually presented him with, I guess you can say, evidence, but he brought this to Freud's attention that one of the driving forces behind religious belief was what he was talking about, spiritual consolation, but like an almost warm, loving feeling that people would get when they would encounter God. So basically, God experience was, a driving force behind religious belief, and Freud was presented with this because what his colleague found is that it had tremendous healing effects in psychotherapy. And Freud dismissed it because it was religious and it had to do with God.
Yeah.
I've found in my own personal life, when I'm struggling with, periods of higher anxiety, or when I was younger, even panic attacks, or just couldn't let something go, I tend to have an obsessive mind that can do a lot of good, but can also get me in trouble sometimes.
Yeah. Our gifts are often our great weakness too.
Yep. I've found moments of deep prayer and spiritual consolation and, just to put in a word, God experience to be tremendously healing and effective when it comes to anxiety, depression, mental health, etc. There is a lot of talk or even research being done by serious people with regard to psychedelic use and spiritual experience within psychedelic use that they are finding to have tremendous benefits with regard to mental health outcomes like PTSD, anxiety disorders, OCD, those types of things. But I always say, like, the real thing is just God experience, right? And I've found that to just be, it really does have a healing effect. Touch on that a little bit, but then also too, but you also can't get to the point where you're solely reliant on those things, which is kind of where finding God within the suffering comes into play.
Yeah, well, I think the first thing that, we look at Freud or people like that, and any modern day psychologist, any modern day anything, is there's millennia of human beings who found purpose and meaning and healing in religion. Whether it's from the pagan world to today, right? Through all of the different religions, to ideologically disregard all of that would be like a medical doctor, a physician disregarding millennia of wisdom for a limited couple of years. I mean, Sigmund Freud died in the 20th century. I mean, he died during the lifetime of many of the people who might be listening to this podcast, and you look at that and you just say that this is how sad that you would reject that you would throw that away. I think this is something Jordan Peterson's contending with on a regular basis. I mean, he's making an impact. You see this man, he's wrestling, I think his new book is called that. It was We Who Wrestle with God. I mean, we need that, it's and it's even if someone was an atheist and turned and said that I'm just going to entertain this just to bring up the wrestling, right? To draw people out of themselves so that they can find some sort of healing in psychology. But to reject it wholesale means that you stopped thinking a long time ago. I mean, if I ran into a psychologist that didn't believe in God, I'd say, or at least wouldn't entertain the aspects of religion, I'd say you threw away your science a long time ago.
because of the proven effects that it's had with
Yes,
regard to healing. Yeah, it's
exactly.
interesting. Like the atheistic argument is like, well, your subjective experience doesn't mean that God is true or God is real. But it's like, well, what about the subjective experience of millions of people in the present and millions and millions and millions of people who have existed throughout time?
Or you could say your subjective experience of yoga, your subjective experience of psychedelic use or whatever it might be. I mean, it's like you're assuming that it's immediately subjective.
Right, and you also have similar experience, like God experience, and
Yes.
and what comes from it is very consistent across time and place.
Exactly. And when you look at these people, you look a lot of the psychologists, you look at a lot of the thinkers that were atheists, is look at their personal life. I mean, Freud had a disaster of a personal life. His poor daughter was just she had more issues than Sports Illustrated. I mean, she was a psychological mess, and a psychologist in her own right, But you also look at this whole rejection of God, as Marx referred as the opioid of the masses, the opiate of the masses. Well, it seems to do a lot for a lot of people. So if it's just opium, well, smoke up, Johnny. At least there's something there,
Right.
But Marx was and a lot of this kind of atheistic thing comes out of the Marxist principle of today's. Marx was a disaster. All of his kids were complete disasters. 2 of them committed suicide. He was an absolute wreck of a human being. He didn't bathe. He was known to be just a horrible person who lived off the capitalist parents of Engels,
Yeah.
and things like that. So you look at this atheistic prospect, and I run into people like this all the time. They'll argue with me, and I go, but you look, I know you don't believe in God, but at least look at your life and say how miserable you are.
Right.
I mean, you're just miserable and you're unhappy and you're dark.
Right. It's like we have to consider but we have to consider that belief in God from an objective measure standpoint results in a high level of human thriving.
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot of people that have been, I would say, tricked in a materialist, secular, atheistic culture that comes from the Enlightenment. Reason first, or primarily reason, as you had mentioned before.
Which then is ultimately abdicated anyway. Then it's just emotivism.
And many people have been tricked by that.
Oh, yeah.
You see the results, for both men and women. It results in different types of behavior in different ways. But the bottom line is that it's making both of us miserable.
Oh, yeah. You see the vacuous unhappiness in people's eyes so often. Something that's amazed me a lot, and this is maybe tangential, but I walked into a thing. There was a thing with a bunch of parents that I saw in the city, and everybody's on their phone. You walk in, no one's talking to each other. Everybody's locked into the phone. Everybody is just trying to escape their misery. And
Escape
it's like
their life. Yeah.
and people are sharing ideas. I'm like, if you just first shared that with God, that's called prayer. And then you turn to the person next to you, that's called community. Just see how much happier you would be. I think a lot of the psychological problems we have today are because of the technology that we have. And I'm not anti-technology. I mean, we're using it right now, but it's everyone knows it. It's like, it's not even a secret. Everybody knows it. And in a conversation, you get in a conversation with people like, yeah, the phones are really killing everything we're doing today. Hold on, let me fact check you really quick on that. It's like,
Let me fact check, and the facts aren't even true.
exactly.
On your phone.
And so it's that it replaces God in conversation. So it replaces prayer. But then also, and this reminds me, I was on a run some years ago through the hills of Novato, California, out near San Francisco. I'm running, and I turned to my friend, as a priest, another priest, and I turned and I said, have you seen any churches here? I was going, we did like an 8-mile run. I didn't see a single church. He said, when you live in paradise, why do you need God? And I thought, a lot of people they've tried to create paradise and found it hell.
Yeah, we have more resources, more comfort, more safety. and at any time in history.
No.
Yet we're some of the most miserable we've ever been.
Oh, it's amazing how miserable America. You know, it's when I take people on missions, and they go to mission country and things like that, and out, you know, third world countries and stuff. Everyone's they're so much happier than us. Yeah, because they don't have all the comforts, and they believe in God, and they have community. You know, it's really not difficult.
Oh, we were built for more than that.
Yeah.
A lot of the psychological misery that we're experiencing nowadays results in behavioral issues.
Mm-hmm.
You have men that are miserable, that don't know how to build themselves up, into men that are attractive or competent for women. You have men that, you know, struggle to talk to women or even get women. You have women that, and men, but you have women who engage in hookup culture and rack up body counts, as they say in you know, modern online language. What is the answer for these men and women going through this, especially young men and women who are, you know, maybe seem like they're lost in this modern day and age?
People have given in to fear. A lot of this comes out of fear. There's a great moment in Moonstruck with Cher and Nicolas Cage, and I think it's Cher's character turns to her mother and says, "Why do men cheat?" And she said, "Because they're afraid of death." She says, "It's like, wow, that's deep." I think that obviously God is the answer to all these things, but there's this fear amongst people. There's a fear of death. There's a fear of abandonment. There's a fear of loneliness. There's a fear of inadequacy. All these different fears fear is a heavy motivator. And so people become very motivated by that fear. And so think of like the hookup culture. A lot of that comes out, which isn't as intense as it once was because of pornography. Like, people are not even able to fornicate as well anymore, because porn is created. You know, I think it's Peterson who says there's alphas and there's betas and then there's like gammas. The gammas are you're just watching the alphas and the betas. You know, it's like you're not even in the game anymore. You know, and that does it, and that really that emasculates men and women. Pornography used to be a male thing, most predominant. It's not anymore. It's almost 50-50. It's almost an equal split. Maybe the different aspects of how that pornography is received, taken in, might be different, but I think a large problem with men and women not disconnecting is fear. So, for instance, feminism has destroyed women. Modern feminism, it's a failed project. And it's so sad to see it. Why? Because what happens is that there's this the fear that that men are not trustworthy. So I have to do everything. This creates an immense amount of anxiety. We talked about this a little earlier, but is that I have to be protector, provider, and nurturer. I have to be everything. I have to be capable of everything in the event that they are untrustworthy. So that's man's problem. That's man's fault, right? That they dropped that ball on that. And wasn't that the original problem? The original problem. I mean, like Eve falls to the sin because Adam's not standing in his place as a man and saying he should have grabbed that snake and broke its neck. Mm-hmm. Right? Or took the hit and took the bite. Mm-hmm. And so men have abdicated their responsibility. And then you had the rise of modern feminism. And the rise of modern feminism really is a Marxist paradigm, of course, as well. It's atheistic and Marxist in its way. But so there's a bitterness towards men. So the women say, I have to do all these things. So what happens is that modern feminism also said you have to compete with men by being like them. And so women don't stand in their femininity. I mean, a woman that truly is living from her place of femininity and really living with femininity has so much power. Mm-hmm. You know, when a woman who truly is living from that place of femininity walks into a room, the men just melt. They don't
extremely attractive.
stare them like, you can't lust after her.
It's extremely attractive.
Extremely attractive.
Yeah.
You want to die
not
for
in
her.
a lustful way, right?
Absolutely. You want to die for her. You want to give yourself for her. Just when she walks in there, she doesn't have to do anything. I said the difference between like the kind of modern woman and the true woman is that the modern woman shows up. The feminine woman arrives. She arrives. She walks into the room and it's like, who is who is that? And so feminism has really convinced women that you have to be like men, which means that they're more aggressive. They're on the prowl, and that's very unattractive for men. So it's attractive for a man in that he can hook up with her. In the same way that like the aggressive prostitute on the street says, "Hey, honey, you want a good time?" Right? It's like, "Oh yeah, sure." But he doesn't want to die for her. The heart of a woman wants a man who's going to be able to do that. So the lifestyle, or like that living that way, is not going to end up with the result you have. That causes bitterness and it causes more fear. I'm afraid I'm going to be alone. Men on the other end, especially young men, there's someone told me about a very interesting thing. I forget the name of it now. It's but there's men today. A lot of young men are getting jobs. They're getting jobs they can work remotely, and they're moving to other countries so they can meet women from other countries, because they say that American women have become too aggressive and they just don't find it attractive. They want to go somewhere else. And it's interesting to hear that.
By aggressive? Like
aggressive, just become like men.
Become like men.
Yeah, and they're like, that's not attractive to me. And so they'll go to many other countries and things like that. I'm not saying all women are like that by any means. Don't get me wrong, but there's been this problem. There's a high percentage in America where it's like this. And what happens is that
in Western countries.
So if men, if the women are like, I can do it, I don't need you, then the man is going to turn around and be kind of lazy and be like, all right, fine. And then I'm going to go live for myself and do my thing, right? You want me to use you, and I'll use you, right? I mean, it's an awful thing,
right?
It's,
and this is
no virtue.
This is the movement of where of what you would say is the red pill or the men go their own way movement. And
Yes,
and it's a reaction to feminism.
Yes, feminism was a reaction to like a lack of real masculinity. I mean, I think one of the rises,
true toxic masculinity, is what feminism reacted to, but it was an overcorrection.
Yeah. Well, I would also say, we talk about like emotionally unavailable men. I would say that, which causes anxiety in women. Perhaps after the Second World War, a lot of men came back from the war and they were shell shocked. They had PTSD, no doubt. Not all of them, but many of them. So they come back in that, but they also had a cadre. They had a band of brothers. They had a purpose. They were fighting a good war. And so what happens is they come back, and they often were emotionally distant from their families. They immersed themselves in work. They immersed themselves in whatever club they joined or something, and they weren't present to their families. And they let their wife kind of carry the burden in a lot of ways.
And women didn't have rights. They couldn't get out of the house. They were responsible for
whether it was social rights
or
or
their kids, right?
Those things. What happened is the bitterness grew from that. And I was like, well, to hell with you.
Right.
And it became a reaction.
Somewhat rightfully so.
Yes, yeah. There was a lot of problems.
And those emotionally unavailable men were also likely sleeping around.
Yeah.
It created a culture where you had but not in every case. But when you
there were a lot of really good men too.
Sure, of course there were. But
like my grandfather.
But when you look at like the kind of like classical toxic masculinity that I would say feminism was a reaction to.
Yeah.
It was the same thing that women are doing now with regard to saying that we don't need you, saying that
men, and in fact, you are bad. Men are bad. Men are bad. They're evil. They're that's an awful thing, because you look and say, well, then if I'm unredeemable, then why bother?
Right.
Right. And then a lot of men are doing that. It's like, well, if I'm unredeemable and if I'm just going to get accused of something or be hated or whatever it might be, the men turn around and are like, well, I'm not going to bother.
Right.
So I'm going to go be with the guys and go have adventures or do whatever it is. And they're going to be lonely and maybe,
Right. Well, now you have a lot of modern women that are sleeping around, which is very unattractive to men. Like that's not what men are looking for in a wife.
Mm-hmm.
And you also have women that are pursuing careers as a high priority, generally women do better in school. Generally women do better in the workplace, just from a straight metric standpoint. And you have women that are able to do well in the marketplace and make good money. And they really are arriving at a point to where it's like, well, why do we even need men? And I think this is driving one of the big meaning and identity crises in men.
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of men,
what is their role
straight
if they can't
men
find a wife
are
and have a
really
family?
like saying, well, what's the point?
Yeah.
A lot of people have given up.
Yeah.
And it's sad when you see a man who's lost his heart. I was talking about the circus. And, there was another experience. I was on the circus train, and they were driving through the bush of Texas, and the guy who was running the lion tamer, he was the trainer. He was from Australia, and he goes, "Yeah, James, would you like to feed the lions?" And I said, "Yeah." And I said, "Well, when the train stops," he goes, "No, we feed them while we're moving." I don't know if they actually did that, but he had me do that. I was like, "Okay, well, we'll walk down the aisle and I'll just feed them." He was like, "No, you got to feed them from the outside of the train." And I'm like, we're going like 80 miles per hour down a track. He's like, "Oh yeah, you just wear the harness and you put it up and yeah, it'll be great." So he puts me in a harness, clips me to the side of the train, hands me meat, and I kept going. I was like walking back and forth, like moving. And he goes, "Yeah, just kick the latch, and the latch will fly up, and you just put the food under there." And I said, "How much space is there between me and the gate?" Yeah, it's about 2 feet. And I go, "There's 2 feet of open space between me and the lion?" And yeah, it'll be fine. He's like, "They don't want you, they want the food." And I'm like, "Okay, let's do it." And I'm like, I'm going down, and as I'm going down to the first one, I hear, "Don't forget, they're trained. They're not tame." It was fantastic. So I'm going and I'm feeding them. It's just, and then on about the second to last one, I think it was the second to last one, my foot slipped and the harness caught me and I was face to face with the lion was right here, just right there. I felt his breath or her breath. It was the lioness, which are bigger than the male lions. Her breath on my face, and she was just looking at me, and I was like, I was holding the meat, and she kind of looked over at the meat and then looked at me. And I'm like, "Here." I just handed her the meat, and she just takes it and she's gnawing on it as she's staring at me. And I'm like doing a pull-up to pull myself up. And there's like brush hitting me on the rear end as I'm like, flying. And I like pull myself up and I close the gate and I'm like, go up. And I get back and he goes, "Wow." You can tell he was really nervous. And he goes, "Where? Well, you survived. It was great." I mean, it was something. It was something. It was a real experience. But don't forget, they're trained. They're not tame. So many men have, just because of the circumstances, have just accepted being tamed. They were not wild at heart. So many men have just said, "You know what, to hell with it." And you see it, and it's sad. There's this kind of like listless days. One of the male lions in the show, he was there because I guess you have all these lionesses that are performing, but in a pride, you need the male lion just present there. He didn't really perform. He was just there to make sure that the lionesses all, they kind of took his lead. But you saw him there, and he was like in this cage. He was alone. This dazed look, glazed look in his eyes. He wasn't out on the range as you should be. I felt for him. They were treated very well. They were never abused, but there was something about him. And I look and I go, wow, that's so many men. Mm. So many men have that dazed, glazed, distant look. And what happens is that then men start to become, this is where you get toxic masculinity. Because then a lot of times you get this reaction of, I'm just going to focus on self-improvement. And you get these guys that are all about self-improvement and all these promises and all this fitness all the time. And I'm going to do all these things to prove myself, these dangerous races, all these other things. And the problem is that
make tons of money and get tons
of money and all these different things.
Revenge on the women.
The problem is that they're not made for that. Men are made to give themselves. They're made to serve. Right? We're made to spend ourselves. We're made to be exhausted at the end of the day. We're meant to die for them. Mm-hmm. And as long as guys aren't doing that, they're miserable. Absolutely miserable.
So what can we do?
Die. No, we have to live for other people. You know, guys will tell me, whether it's someone who's struggling with porn or somebody who's struggling with like rejection, abandonment, or somebody, whatever, all these different things. Who are you serving? Who are you dying for? Who are you giving yourself for? Don't worry about it. You don't have to go heal things and all these things. That'll all come. It's who are you emptying yourself for?
Mm-hmm.
And you know, making the choice to get married is not the emptying. It's living from the place of that marriage. It's standing in that place of self-gift, right? And if guys say they're trying to discern what it is, like whether it's I'm trying to figure out what to do with my life, or I'm trying to discern my vocation, or I'm trying to discern what it is, figure out what God wants of me. My question is always, who are you giving yourself to? We don't discern in a vacuum. Go serve. Go give yourself.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's the biggest thing.
Yeah, go do.
Yeah,
You learn
that's why
a lot by doing.
That's why so many young guys, and it's sad that the military has just been so destroyed.
Yeah.
But there's so many guys they were like, I want to go join the military. Why? Because I want to make a difference.
Right.
In other words, I want to go give myself. I'm willing to die for something, you know, and they don't, they can't, you know.
Find what it is you're willing to die for.
Yes, exactly. Well, you know, I remember my dad saying this to me many years ago as a kid. I'll never forget it. And it really resonated in my life. He said, what are you willing to die for? The answer to that will tell you what you're willing to live for.
That's really good advice.
Yeah.
It's great advice to ask yourself. It's great advice to ask your son.
Oh, yeah.
Well, I think that's a good note to end on.
Great.
Father Searby, where can people find you?
You can find Holiness for the Working Day podcast. It's
Okay.
available everywhere podcasts are.
Okay. Thank you for coming on.
Thanks
I
for having
appreciate
me.
it.
It was awesome.